The night my mother-in-law told me I was raising my daughter wrong, I smiled and said nothing. What I didn't say was that I had already spoken to a family lawyer 3 days before. My name is Melissa, and I was 31 years old when my husband's family decided they had more authority over my child than I did. We lived in Mississauga, Ontario. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, for 8 years, worked in commercial real estate downtown. We had a 7-year-old daughter named Zoe. On paper, we looked fine. More than fine. We had a house on a quiet street near the lake, a good school district, 2 cars in the driveway. The kind of life you'd see in a real estate listing and feel a small pang of envy about. What the listing wouldn't show was his mother sitting at my kitchen table every Sunday, rearranging the way I loaded my dishwasher. His parents had immigrated from rural Newfoundland before he was born and had built the kind of tight family unit that sounds beautiful from the outside. Everyone within 20 minutes of each other. Sunday dinners that weren't optional. A group chat with 47 members that pinged at 7 in the morning. I respected the closeness, genuinely. What I didn't understand, not until years in, was that closeness in their family meant sameness. And I was never the same. I had grown up differently. My mother was a nurse who worked nights. My father had left when I was 4. I learned early to be self-sufficient, to research things, to ask questions. When Zoe was born, I threw myself into parenting the same way. Reading, consulting her pediatrician, making choices based on what I actually learned rather than what I'd always seen done. That was apparently a problem. His mother had opinions about everything. How I dressed Zoe in winter. Too many layers. How I packed her lunch. Not enough carbohydrates. How I handled Zoe's screen time, sleep schedule, birthday party themes, dentist appointments. She once told me that letting a 7-year-old choose her own backpack was spoiling her. I am not exaggerating. My husband, I watched this happen so gradually I barely noticed, had 2 different personalities. With me, he was reasonable, warm, a good father. At family events, something shifted. He became a 17-year-old boy who needed his mother's approval for everything. He laughed when she made jokes at my expense. He went quiet when I needed him to speak. He told me privately that she didn't mean anything by it. He told me she was from a different generation. He told me she just cared a lot. For 6 years, I absorbed this. For 6 years, I told myself it was manageable, that I was being too sensitive, that this was what compromise looked like. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Thursday in February. His parents had decided to host a family gathering to celebrate his uncle's retirement. It was a Tuesday to Sunday trip to their family cottage near Parry Sound, Georgian Bay. About 30 people. Zoe was excited about the snow and the lake. I packed carefully. Brought her medications. She has mild asthma. Brought her books, her favorite sweater, her stuffed rabbit. I had done this enough times to know you bring everything, because nothing at that cottage was ever where you needed it. On the second day, his mother started on the medication. Zoe had woken up in the night with some tightness in her chest, nothing serious. I used the inhaler. She went back to sleep. In the morning, I mentioned it at breakfast, just informatively. His mother set down her coffee and looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments she believed I was being dramatic. She probably just needs fresh air, she said. You worry too much. Her doctor prescribed the inhaler, I said, keeping my voice even. I'm following his instructions. When her father was little, we didn't have all these medications. She looked around the table for support and several relatives nodded. His sister, who was sitting to her right, said something about how kids these days were over-medicated. Someone else agreed. The table became a small panel discussion about whether Zoe needed treatment at all. I looked at my husband. He was eating his eggs. He wasn't going to say anything. I had known him long enough to read the set of his shoulders. He was hoping I would let it go. He always hoped I would let it go. I'm not going to stop giving her the medication her doctor prescribed, I said. Quiet, firm, final. His mother looked at me like I had said something deeply offensive. Nobody said stop. It felt that way. The table went still. Then his mother said the word she always used when she wanted to end an argument. Sensitive. And that was it, that single word, aimed at me in front of his entire family while he ate his eggs. Something shifted in me. Not loudly. It was the quietest shift. Like a door closing in a room nobody else could hear. That evening, after Zoe was asleep, my husband came to find me on the back porch. The lake was frozen. Sky was close, very clear. "You embarrassed her in front of everyone," he said. I turned to look at him. "I defended our daughter's medical care. You always do this. You make everything a confrontation." I said one sentence. He shook his head. He had that look. The look that meant he was about to say something he believed was reasonable that was actually just a way to make me feel like the problem. "My family just wants to be involved. You've never made it easy for them." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I said, "I think we see this situation very differently." He took that as agreement. He went back inside. I stayed on the porch for another hour. The ice on the lake made sounds like something settling. I thought about what it would take for things to change. I had asked for couples counseling twice. He had agreed both times and canceled both times. I had had versions of this same conversation for 6 years. The pattern was clear, and patterns don't break themselves. That night, lying in the dark while he slept beside me and Zoe breathed steadily. In the next room, I made a decision that surprised even me. Not a dramatic decision, a quiet one. The kind you don't announce. When we got back to Mississauga, I called a family lawyer. Her name was not on anyone's guest list. She had an office in downtown Toronto, on Bay Street. I had found her through the Law Society of Ontario referral service, which I'd looked up on my lunch break 6 months earlier, just out of what I'd told myself was curiosity. Apparently, it had been something else. We met on a Tuesday morning. I brought a notebook. I asked her to walk me through everything. What separation looked like in Ontario, what custody typically looked like for a primary caregiver, what my rights were regarding Zoe's medical decisions. She explained the concept of decision-making responsibility under the Children's Law Reform Act. She was direct and she didn't waste words. By the time I left her office, I had a clearer picture of my life than I'd had in years. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think people imagine these moments as being full of certainty. They aren't. I drove home on the 401 with the radio off and felt mostly terrified. I loved my husband. At least, I loved the version of him that existed without his family in the room. I didn't want to blow up my daughter's life. I didn't want to be wrong about something this big. But I also knew that nothing was going to change. That was the quietest, most certain thought I had ever had. Nothing was going to change. I spent the next 3 weeks being extremely normal. I made dinner. I attended Zoe's skating lessons and stood with the other parents in the cold arena lobby and talked about the curriculum night coming up. I went to work. I manage operations for a mid-sized logistics company, mostly remote, which turned out to be important. I answered every text from his mother with a polite, brief reply. I smiled at Sunday dinners. I let his sister tell me about her renovation plans and asked follow-up questions like I cared about her backsplash. Meanwhile, I was reorganizing my entire life. I called my closest friend, who lives in Victoria, BC. She'd moved there 4 years ago for her partner's work and had been asking me to visit for years. We talked for 3 hours. I didn't ask her for anything concrete at first. I just needed to say out loud what I was thinking. She listened without interruption. At the end, she said, "Tell me what you need." I told her. She made 2 phone calls that week. She knew someone who ran a small operations firm in Victoria that had been looking for a remote hybrid manager for months. He wanted to talk to me. I said yes. Over the following week, I had 4 video interviews. They were thorough. They went well. On a Wednesday afternoon, while Zoe was at school and my husband was at a client lunch, I received a formal offer by email. It included a salary $6,000 higher than what I was making, benefits, flexible hours, and the option to work hybrid from any BC location. I read the offer 3 times. Then I accepted it. I want to explain something about the logistics of what came next, because I know it matters. I had already spoken to my lawyer about this. Zoe and I were both Canadian citizens. My husband and I had no formal custody agreement because we were still married. There was no separation order, no court document limiting Zoe's travel within Canada. Interprovincial relocation with a child during an intact marriage is a complex area of family law, and my lawyer was clear that I needed to act carefully and within the bounds of what the law allowed. We discussed every step. I was not leaving the country. I was moving to a different province, which is a legal act, with my daughter, to a city where I had support and employment. This was documented, disclosed, and done correctly. I enrolled Zoe in a school in Victoria. I found a furnished apartment in the Fairfield neighborhood, close to Beacon Hill Park, which I knew she would love because she is obsessed with ducks. I arranged for our 4 things to be packed and stored, transferred to Victoria in stages. I called my own mother and told her what was happening. She cried a little and then said, "Good, I'll come visit." My husband, during all of this, was still operating on the assumption that I had accepted the Sunday dinner dynamic as permanent. 2 days before I left, he came home with dinner from my favorite Thai place on Huron, Ontario. He set the containers on the table while Zoe set out chopsticks with the focused seriousness of a 7-year-old performing an important task. He poured himself a sparkling water and sat down and said, with the tone of someone who has decided not to revisit something unpleasant, "I think we've both moved past the cottage thing." I watched him open the pad thai. "Have we? It wasn't worth getting into. You know how these family things go." He handed Zoe her spring rolls. "I think the spring rolls are better this time. Did they change something?" Zoe said. She thought the sauce was different. I sat there watching the two of them discuss the spring rolls, and I thought about 6 years, and I thought about Zoe's inhaler, and I thought about a woman on a frozen porch deciding something quietly. I thought about how he had never once asked if I was all right after that dinner. Not once. "I think you're right," I said. "I think we've both moved past it." He seemed relieved. We ate dinner. He washed up. He watched a hockey game. The Leafs lost, which he took personally as he always did. We went to bed at the usual time. He fell asleep within 10 minutes, which he had always been able to do, effortlessly, a skill I had envied for 8 years. I lay awake and watched the ceiling. The next morning he left for work at 7:45. He kissed Zoe on the top of her head. He said he'd try to be home by 6. He took his travel mug and his laptop bag and he pulled out of the driveway. I watched the car until it turned the corner. Then I took Zoe's hand and I said, "We're going on our adventure." She already knew. I had told her 2 weeks earlier, carefully, in terms a 7-year-old can hold. A new city, a new school, ducks in the park near our new apartment. She had asked if she could bring her rabbit, and I said yes. She had asked if Daddy would visit, and I said yes, we would work that out. She had thought about it for a moment, and then asked if the ducks would be friendly, and I said I genuinely didn't know, but we would find out together. At the airport. YZ, Pearson, the same terminal I'd flown out of 100 times. She held my hand through security and dragged her little backpack with the confidence of someone who had decided this was going to be fine. I had her travel authorization documentation in a folder in my carry-on. Her health card, her school registration. Everything organized. Everything in order. The way I had always done things. My phone rang when we were past the gate. I looked at the screen. I already knew. He had come home early. I'm not sure why. Maybe something canceled. Maybe he'd forgotten something. He'd found the letter I left on the kitchen table, next to the pepper grinder, because I wanted to make sure he saw it. "What is this?" he said, when I picked up. It wasn't really a question. "It's what I said in the letter," I answered. "Melissa." His voice was strange. I had never heard that particular quality in it before. Not angry. Not yet. Something closer to disoriented. Like a person in a room who has just realized the room has been rearranged. "You're at the airports." "Yes. You can't do this. I've done this legally and carefully. My lawyer can send your lawyer the documentation whenever you're ready." The word lawyer seemed to land. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing. In the background, I heard the familiar sounds of our house. The hum of the refrigerator, Maybe the heating system ticking. Why didn't you talk to me? He said. And that was the question that cost me something, because it wasn't wrong, and I had asked myself the same thing. I did, I said. I talked to you for 6 years. You ate your eggs. He was silent. Zoe was watching a video on her tablet, headphones on, unbothered, eating the crackers I'd packed. I watched her for a moment. I need you to hear me, I said, quieter now. I don't want Zoe to grow up watching me disappear to keep the peace. I don't want her to think that's what love looks like. I've tried every other way I knew how to fix this. This is the way I have left. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, where are you staying? I told him. He called again from the tarmac, once, just before we boarded. His mother had called him. His sister had called him. Half the Sunday dinner group chat had apparently been activated. He sounded exhausted. My mother wants to know if this is because of the cottage, he said. I almost laughed. Not unkindly, just at the gap between what had happened and what his family was able to see. Tell her it's because of a lot of things, I said, and that I hope she's well. I boarded the plane. Zoe fell asleep on my shoulder somewhere over Lake Superior, her rabbit tucked under her arm. I stayed awake and watched the dark landscape below and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was breathing at full capacity. Victoria was cold and bright when we landed. My friend had offered to pick us up, but I'd rented a car instead. I needed to do it myself. Needed to feel the steering wheel in my hands. Needed the act of driving to a new address to belong to me. Zoe spotted the ocean from the car and made a sound of pure, uncomplicated delight. The apartment was smaller than our house. It smelled like fresh paint and someone else's candles. There was a window in Zoe's room that faced east, and the next morning, the light came in, and she stood in it in her pajamas with her rabbit and said, very seriously, I like it here. I sat on the floor beside her, and we ate the granola bars I'd packed and looked at the light. The weeks that followed were not easy. Starting over at 31 with a 7-year-old is a logistical challenge that nobody prepares you for. There were forms, there were phone calls, there were days when Zoe missed her dad and cried quietly in the bath, which was harder than anything else. I let her cry. I didn't explain it away. I sat on the edge of the tub and held her hand and said that missing people is real and it's okay, and Dad loves her and we'd figure out how to make visits work. My husband and I began communicating through our lawyers first, and then, slowly, directly. It was difficult. There were weeks when he was angry, where the messages were short and cold. There were weeks when I could see him trying to understand, and those were somehow harder because they reminded me of who he was capable of being. His mother called me once, about 6 weeks in. I answered, which surprised her. She asked why I had done this. I told her, calmly, everything I had never said out loud. Not to punish her. Not because I wanted a fight. Just because, at 31 years old, I had finally decided that silence wasn't the same as peace. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I didn't realize. I don't know if she meant it. I think she probably meant some version of it. I said I appreciated that, and I meant that too. The legal process of formalizing our separation and co-parenting arrangement took several months and required mediation. Our parenting plan gave my husband regular video calls, school holidays, and 2 extended in-person visits per year. He flew out to Victoria, which he did both times, and he and Zoe spent a week at a rental near the park, and he texted me a photo of her feeding ducks, which I looked at for a long time. He is doing the work now. Couples therapy, on his own initiative. He told me this during one of the co-parenting calls, matter-of-factly, not as a bid to reconcile but as a statement of fact. He said his therapist had asked him to think about the times he'd stayed silent when he shouldn't have. He said it had been an uncomfortable exercise. I told him that sounded like a useful exercise. There was a pause, and then he said, I'm sorry, Melissa. Not for one argument. For a pattern. I had been waiting 8 years to hear those words. Standing in my kitchen in Victoria, looking out at the neighbor's garden through the window, I felt something release that I hadn't even known was still held. Thank you, I said. That matters. We are not getting back together. I want to be clear about that because I know people want a certain kind of ending, and I can only offer the one that's true. We are co-parents. We are, slowly and carefully, becoming something that might be called respectful. Zoe is doing well. Genuinely, measurably well. Her teacher told me at her first parent interview that she was one of the most confident and communicative kids in the class. I held that in my chest for days. His family has not all come around. His sister hasn't spoken to me since I left. His mother sends Zoe a birthday card, which Zoe reads and then puts on her dresser next to her rabbit. That's enough for now. My daughter is growing up in a house where her mother makes decisions and stands behind them, where we talk about feelings without them being used against us, where I can follow the doctor's instructions without justifying them to anyone. That is not a small thing. The night my husband assumed I'd accepted the situation, I had already accepted something else entirely. That I deserved a life I didn't have to make myself smaller to fit inside. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying, for the first time in 8 years, to choose myself without apologizing for it. The ducks at Beacon Hill Park, for what it's worth, are extremely friendly. Zoe told me so on a Tuesday afternoon in April, standing at the edge of the pond, tossing torn pieces of a whole grain baguette, with the kind of joy that only exists when you are 7 and unbothered and exactly where you're supposed to be. I stood beside her, coat on, Vancouver Island wind in my face, and thought, this is what I was protecting. Choosing yourself isn't always a dramatic exit. Sometimes it's a quiet decision made on a frozen porch in the dark, a lawyer's business card in your coat pocket, and the patience to wait until you're ready. The family who called me difficult never once asked why. The man I married never once asked if I was okay. I asked myself, finally. And I answered,